So I just want to give a little bit of my background so you know where I'm coming from and why everything happened like it did. In the first place, I was born in Canada, in Kitchener, Ontario, and my dad was just a regular, he was a lab technician actually. My mom was a seamstress in a factory that made Arrow shirts. And so they were just ordinary people until a very famous preacher from China came to our town. His name was Huijiga, or something like that. Anyway, everybody knew him. And they were so impressed with what he said that they invited him to our home. And he came to our home, and before he left, he picked me up. I was 18 months old. He picked me up in his arms, and he prayed for me. And I don't know if that's when I first felt, when God first called me. But I've always known that that's what my future was, to go to China. And so after that, my dad felt led to go to seminary. So he quit his job by faith, moved us to London, Ontario, and he went to seminary, trusting God to supply the money that they needed to do that. He worked in a factory at night, but he went to seminary. And so while we were there, I was 4 years old when we went, and I had a little brother. And my mom opened a Bible club for kids in the area. And one day she gave an object lesson about Jesus wanting to go and live in people's lives. And she had some hearts that she could show. And she said, Jesus came knocking on one person's life in their heart. And that said, can I come in? And the person said, no, I don't have room for you. I've got other interests. And so he went to different hearts. He went to 3 different ones. And they all turned him down. And finally one said, yes, you can come into my heart. And I felt so sorry for Jesus, because everybody was turning him down, that when I went home, I didn't say anything to my parents about this. I went into my room and I shut the door and I knelt down and I said, Jesus, you can come into my heart. And I really felt I was doing Jesus a favor. It took me quite a few years to find out who was doing who the favor. But anyway, I knew he was in my heart. And I knew that the one thing I didn't know was that I would go to heaven when I die. And so I had Jesus in my heart. So then when Dad finished seminary, he went to Toronto, and we lived in Toronto a couple years. That's where I started playing the piano. No, I guess I started it when I was 4. But anyway, and we saw a lot of missionaries, because my dad and mom were on the home staff of a mission sending agency. And the missionaries came and went. There were a lot from India, some from Africa, and we saw these missionaries and we got to know them because we all lived in a huge house that held about 40 people. But among all of those, there was not a single one to China. And so I never got to see anybody that had been to China. And so then my dad, after he was ordained and all that, he felt called to go to South Dakota. And I don't know if any of you have been there, but that's about as far as different as it can be from Toronto, big city of Toronto. We could look 5 miles west of our house and not see a thing, just grass and prairie hills. And so that was a huge, you had to kind of adjust to it, but I can see that now as God be blessing me too and making me able to accommodate or learn from where I am. And so while I was a lot of missionary biographies and things, so I'd bring them to school and I'd read them. And I read these stories of missionaries to China, Hudson Taylor and other really famous. His daughter wrote 700 and some page, 2 books of his life, and I read those in no time. And that's when I faced the first challenge in my whole life as a missionary, because those missionaries really loved God. And they prayed for people, and they loved to read the Bible, and it made such a difference for them. Well, I could quote whole books of the Bible. My dad had started me memorizing when I was 2. And I could quote the whole book of John, and 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, and James. A lot of the Bible. So I thought I knew all the good parts. And so when I read the Bible, it was boring. It didn't say a thing to me. And another trouble was that they prayed. And man, I'd start to pray in about 2 sentences or 3. That won't help. Yeah, And so in 2 or 3 sentences, I'd about said everything I could think of. And so it started to dawn on me that if I was going to go to China and tell people how much God loves them and all this, and I didn't feel a thing, what's that going to mean to them? It's kind of like Jesus said, it's the blind leading the blind, because I didn't feel any love for Jesus. I know Jesus is God and all that. I didn't hate him or anything, but, I didn't feel anything. And I am so thankful that at that time in my life, when I was 10, God gave me awareness of what he really meant when he made people. He intended for us to be in relationship to him. We're his children, and he loves us, and he wants us to love him too. And I first saw it as a difficulty, because how can I preach to the Chinese if I don't love him? But gradually, it won't help me. Yeah, because it's, yeah. But gradually, as time went by, I wanted to know him like that too. And so I began to pray to him and ask him and say, I want to love you. I want to read your word. Help me. But I didn't hear him say anything back. And so sometimes I think, well, maybe I believe in the wrong God. And I'd say, well, if you're not the right one, who is? And I was thirsting for him. And I thirsted for him for 6 years. And finally, when I was 16 years old on Easter Sunday, I happened to be in the church by myself in the afternoon because I was playing the Bible harp for the evening service and I wanted to practice. And this is a little country church and only hold about 40 people. If we really got crowded out, we could hold about 70. But I was all alone. And I started to play, and it was Easter, and I don't know what made me think of it, but it just felt like I had to know him that day. I had to get close to him. So I laid my mallets down, and I went and I sat down on the front bench. And I just loved me. And you know what he did? It was so remarkable. I just felt his love. I'd never been loved like that. I don't doubt my parents loved me, but in those days, parents didn't say to their kids, oh, I love you, and parents didn't say their kids didn't say to their parents. It wasn't like that in those days. And it's not that I didn't think my parents loved me, but I never felt that kind of warmth that he gave me that day. And I just sat there crying and saying, I do love you. Oh, I love you so much. I don't know how long. It could have been an hour or two. I couldn't stop. And it was such a blessing to me. Experience that when it's over, it's done. He's saying to me that this is just the beginning. You're in a doorway, and out in front of you is all that God can do. As long as you're here, and no matter how much he's done, there's always more. There's no limit to how much you can know and love him, and how much he can love you and teach you and help you and use you. And so that was something so special. And it was something that didn't end there, because it's an ongoing thing. And the thing I've found out in all my life since then, no matter where I've been and what I've been doing, that his touch in my life is the most wonderful thing that ever has happened to me. And sometimes even if I'm just out walking and I may be feeling down in the dumps about something, and I look, that warmth just fills me, and I'm not sad anymore. And it does so many things for me as a missionary, and then as a wife, and a mother, and a grandmother. It just keeps going on. And he's there, and he's real. And when I read the Bible, when I read the Bible the first day after that happened, it was a portion I knew by memory. But man, it was as if I'd never seen it before. I saw things about him, and I understood stuff that I never got before when I was reading the Bible or memorizing it. And he says he's the light of the world. Jesus said that. And as he experienced a bit of it to start with, he's been the light in my life. He really is the light of the world. He's also the person that loves you more than anybody else. But You know, he comforts me sometimes when I'm sad, but he does other things. He lets me see more about him that I didn't realize before. Even this morning, I just noticed how Jesus had sent out his disciples to preach the gospel and heal the sick, for them, help them material or some way besides just preaching. And then when they came back to report, and he was so wanting to have time with them and let them tell him what they learned, so he took them off to a quiet place to be by themselves, and immediately 5,000 men came, and their children and wives and everybody. And what it said, what really struck me, he said, Jesus welcomed them. If it were me, I'd have probably said, I'm sorry, I really can't. I've got to do. But he didn't do it. He welcomed them. And it says he healed them. And then he gave them a free dinner besides, because they didn't have any lunch with them. And he fed 5,000 men plus all whoever came with them. That's how Jesus is. And that's what he started letting me see. I knew all those stories before, but even now when I read it every day, I see something about him that I didn't know before. And it's because that's who he is. He's our light. And another thing he does is show you when you make mistakes and when you really goof up. And he's there picking up the pieces, helping you to repent and be sorry and be able to go on. And there's so many good things that he does on a continuing basis. And so I'm so thankful for that. I ask him for wisdom when I don't know what to do. I ask him to show me where I should go or what I should do. He's there. And mind you, he's not speaking in a loud voice that you can hear. I've never heard that. It's just that he touches you, and you feel relieved, or you feel convicted, or you feel loved, whatever it is you need, he's there. So this all happened. Now I'm ready to go to Hong Kong. Well, but I'm only 16, so I've got to wait a little while. So the 16, between 16 and 22, he had lots of things to teach me. And I had lots of chances to work for him and do things in the western part of the state where there weren't any churches and Sunday schools. I'd go out there in the summer with a friend, and we'd go into these communities, and we'd be able to, help people there in many different ways. And so it was all part of my experience of getting ready to go. And even in those places, there were really poor people, and the food you got, the beds you had, the kids had been wetting, and then you sleep in them, and all kinds of stuff like that, And always I'd say to myself, well, this is just good preparation for me, because I'm going to be going to China. It'll probably be a lot worse. But I can tell you the truth. I didn't eat any food in China that was any worse than some of the food I ate there. So anyway, finally in 1959, my chance came. I had a contact with a lady, an English lady in China, somebody in Hong Kong. Somebody introduced us. I had planned to go with the mission board, and there was some mix-up. They asked me to apply, and they never replied to me. So I ended up going out with my church being my sending agency, my prayer partners, the people that will share. They weren't rich people, but they were going to share whatever they had with me so I could live over there. And I was ready to go. And I got my ticket to go on a freighter, on a cargo ship to Hong Kong from San Francisco. I had all my shots. Really had to take a lot in those days. I became an American citizen so that when I came back from Hong Kong, I could come right home and not have to go through all the bother of, whatever you had to do. And I packed my trunk, and I'm ready to go. And it's about, and all of a sudden, a very unexpected challenge. Because one day, all of a sudden, it hit me. I'm going to be gone for 5 years. They don't have phones. We didn't have phones over there. No phone, no email, no way to keep in touch with my family. Why, my youngest brother was married by now, and he was expecting a baby. I wouldn't get to see my niece, and I love children and babies. I wouldn't even get to see her till she's 5 years old. And, there'd be graduations and maybe deaths in the family, all kinds of things, and I wouldn't even know it till it was past. And I don't know why it hit me so hard that day, because, I was going to go for all my life, and it hadn't bothered me before, but all of a sudden, I just couldn't face it. And I started to cry, and I said, I can't go. I can't go, Lord. I can't. And I was sitting there crying, and I just can't do it. And he spoke to me again, and he said, it wasn't a voice in my ears that I could hear, but I could hear him in my heart. He said, don't think I'm sending you there as a sacrifice. I'm not going to make a martyr out of you and you have to give up your life for the Chinese and it's such a bad thing. I'm sending you there because that's the best place on earth for you and I love you. And that's the best place for you. And you know, I believed it. And I dried my tears. I got up from my... went ahead and nobody ever saw me cry. That doesn't mean I never shed any tears. Because it hurts when you say goodbye to somebody for 5 years. But, you know, he was there. And so they had a commissioning service for me just before I left. And as the pastors were praying for me, one of them said a few words of prophecy. When he finished, he said, "You've been rightly named Ruth, because you are going to glean where other people..." In the Bible days, my parents named me after Ruth. And he said, "That's the right name for you, because this is what you're going to do." So it meant he's going to send me to people that might be missed otherwise, or wouldn't be found, and that would be my job. And so I left, and in 1959, I just turned 22, and got on the freighter and went to Hong Kong 19 days, and I lost 10 pounds on the way. We had a very rough trip. I've never been so scared in my life. I thought we were going down quite a few times, and the crew were scared. We had 40 waves, and it's just a little cargo ship. It's not these containers that come into here. And, you know, the ship would go so far this way, and the suitcases would slide to that side, and I'm thinking the cargo in the bottom's probably sliding too. What's going to happen if it doesn't come back up? And then I'm going to go down that way. It was scary. And when it pitched and tossed, then the rudder would come out at the back, and the whole ship would go like this as we're heading down. You know, I was scared. But he got me safely there. And when I got there, Vera was going to meet my boat. The boat docked in the middle of the mile-wide harbor. And they said, "No, the launch will be coming out." There were 11 passengers on the boat. "The launch will be coming out, the one from the Hong Kong side, the one from the Kowloon side. Which one do you want?" I didn't know there were 2 sides. I thought we'd be at a dock somewhere, and, you know, we'd just get off. So I told the captain, "I don't know which side I'm supposed to go off." And he said, "Well, that's all right." He said, "When your friend comes, she'll be on the right one." But she didn't come. And the Chinese have a saying, "Long bui." Cantonese people would know, embarrassed to the extreme. I felt so embarrassed, because those people on the ship, the ship's officers, had been making fun of me they had the time of their lives making fun of me. What do you think a 22-year-old girl is going to do in China anyway? You know, and so now I can't even get off the ship. And so they waited with me till noon, and this is their one day in port. You can imagine how happy they all were about that. And finally, one of them got tired of waiting, and he had been more sincere with me, because he had a little girl that had polio and she was crippled. And he'd ask me often what the others asked too. Well, how can there be a God that really loves people and he does this to a little girl? You know. But he offered to get off and help me get a taxi to go to where I had to go. So I had an envelope with Vera's address on it. So we got off, got the taxi, but the taxi driver couldn't read English. And unfortunately, I couldn't pronounce Chinwan. And I tried, but he couldn't get what I was saying, and I couldn't get what he was saying. And it was like Chinese people say, a chicken talking to a duck. You know? I mean, I talked louder, and then he talked louder. And finally he said, "Well, get in." I mean, he motioned us to get in. We got in, and we went a long, long ways over a mountain and whatever, and we came down into a town, which was Chinwan. And he stopped in the middle of the road, put my suitcase on the ground, got back in and drove off. And I thought he was going to take me to where she was. But actually, there's only a P.O. box address on the way. So anyway, he drove off, and here's the sailor there too. So what am I going to do? So one side was sort of a maternity clinic or something with a bunch of dumpy old houses behind it. Couldn't be there. It had to be on this huge slope of a shanty town, the worst kind of shanty town you could see. So what could you do? You walk up the little path that went through. It was a small, narrow path with gutters, open gutters on both sides, and kids, you know, using it for a toilet, and then further along, some kids would be playing in the thing, and you know, and there was all kinds of sights and smells as we went up there. But as we got partway up there, I met a woman coming down Caucasian woman. She had a bunch of letters in her hand. I walked up to her and I said, "Are you Vera?" "Yes." I said, "Do you know who I am?" "No." "What?" I'd sent her a telegram, because in Japan we changed direction, or we changed the schedule, so we came a week early. I'd sent her a telegram. She should know who I am. "Can you guess?" "No." When I told her it was me, she just about dropped her teeth or something. She was so shocked. So then I walked up the rest of the way up that shantytown thing. And as I was walking up there, it was a miracle. I felt that I found her, but it was also a miracle what happened to me on the way up there. Because as we walked up to the very top where her home was, I felt like I'm home. It just felt like I'm home. I'm where I belong. And you know, that commissioning service prophecy was right. Because that was a place of a huge number of refugees, especially from Shanghai, but from other places too. And they weren't wealthy people. There was one little bit at the very top where there were a few houses that were better than the others, and that's where Vera, this lady that I went to be with, lived in an upstairs apartment. So I went home with her, but I felt at home. And you know what? 67 years later, that's still my home with those people. And you know, Chinwan was a huge metropolis even then, and it was full of refugees and factories. And those people lived difficult lives. Mothers, I knew mothers who had to work, and they'd tie their toddlers to the table leg at home and go off for a whole 12-hour shift, leave them at home. Do you think they wanted to? And people, there were jobs you could get at home. You'd get huge loads of plastic flowers to be assembled. And I tried assembling those, and that really hurts your fingers. But they'd have to do that, and they might get 10 cents for a 12 dozen bunch of flowers. And girls, they work in these factories for 12-hour shifts. Some of them worked even longer than that, and if they worked in the silk mills, they were completely closed in because silk couldn't stand moisture. And so they'd be working in these hot, airless places for 12 hours at a time, little girls, like 12 or 14 years old. And so that's the kind of people that I met when I went there. And now I can say it's been 67 years since I went there first. And it's never lost its, its place in my heart. And it's my home, and it still is, and if I could, I'd be there right now, too. But this is the next best thing, because a bunch of you look familiar anyway. So, of course, everything was a challenge. I mean, the customs, the language, the food. I couldn't get used to the fact that they were so generous. They'd share everything they had. They didn't have much. If you had a camera, if I had a camera, they'd ask me to use it. If I had a radio or a car, I didn't have one then, I did get one later. Anybody would ask you to use it, even if you didn't know them very well. And at first that really puzzled me, because you know how we Americans are. We're pretty, my stuff is my stuff. But they're not like that, and I could see the good in that, because as poor as everybody was, the stuff that they did have was getting used. And they were so generous with me, too, with little that they had. You know, there was one time they brought me some orange juice, and the family that brought it to me, they had nothing to eat but rice with soy sauce on it. And oranges were very expensive, but I had a terrible case of tonsillitis, and I couldn't swallow even my own spit, and they heard about it. And these two ladies brought me almost a quart of orange juice. Well, I felt like David in the Bible, where he poured the water on the ground that the people had brought him from his home well. I felt so bad, I didn't even want to drink it, but I couldn't send it home with them. They wouldn't ever have taken it home. And I just saw their generosity and their kindness so many times. I learned a lot through that. And so another huge challenge, though, for me was the fact that people weren't waiting to hear about our God. They don't have a God that loves them. You know that. I shouldn't say they. I said, you guys didn't either. They have to appease their gods or do something so they won't curse you or hurt you or whatever. And I thought, all these years when I was planning to go, I was just looking forward to telling them about our God who loves them so much. Well, when I went and I tried talking to older people, they didn't want anything to do with a foreign God. And the young people had so many questions. They, from how could he love us and not let the Chinese hear the gospel forever and ever and ever? And why doesn't he kill the devil? I mean, hundreds of questions. And if I could answer them, they still didn't believe. It wasn't that easy. It was much harder than I expected. And that was a challenge. And I'll just give you one example. There was one girl there were two girls, and they lived with me. They were poor, and Vera went home for a year. I had the place to myself, so I invited them to come. And they came after they did their homework, or they came after their dinner at home. And they had homework, and it was a good place because they lived in a really tiny place. So the one girl came to know the Lord almost right away when I got to Hong Kong. She was the first one that I was able to lead to the Lord. But the other one was much more stubborn. Her name was Patty. And she wouldn't even let me talk to her about Jesus. And she wouldn't go to our services or do anything like that. So one day, it was a Saturday, I think, and I was due to speak to the youth group. I was in charge of young people's work, and I was due to speak to them that night. And for some reason, I couldn't get a handle on what I should talk about. And I struggled with it all morning. And I'm getting anxious because, I'm not the kind that can get up and just talk off the top of my head. And all of a sudden, I went to the bathroom, and I found a flood coming up through the bathroom and the kitchen into the rest of the house. It meant we were on water rationing. Water only came in the morning for a couple hours, and so you might turn it on and there wasn't any. It was too early, it hadn't come on yet, and then you'd forget to turn it off. Well, I knew I hadn't done that, so Patty had, of course. And so I was so mad at the Lord. That sounds awful, but I was. I said, Lord, if I had a daughter and this happened to her, I would think that was very unkind, How come I'm struggling so, and then you let this happen today of all days? And, I had to sop that all up and wring rags out and put them into I used a dustpan for a while, and, whatever I could do to get all that water up. And we had a big bag of rice on the floor in the kitchen. We had a huge can of kerosene for our burners. Had moved that all, everything else that was on the floor, and there were things under those that I didn't want to see either. I might cockroaches and other kinds of things hang out in places like that. So I worked most of the afternoon doing that. And I just finished. And by then I'd made things right with the Lord. I said, it's okay. I wasn't right to yell at you like that. I probably yelled a bit too. I was so upset, and it was hot. And so I made my peace with the Lord, and while I was doing it, I was kind of getting some ideas of what to talk about that night. And I got everything in place, and I had the linoleum. I just bought a new piece of linoleum for the floor, and I had that hanging out over the railing outside. And Patty came home. She walks in the door, and she said, what's happened? And I said, somebody forgot to turn off the water this morning. That was me. I remember I did turn. Oh. And I said, but it's okay. She said, what can I do? And I said, well, it's okay. Everything's finished, I've got to go to the young people's group. She didn't go, of course. So I went, and we had a good enough evening with the young people. And I came home, and as soon as I walked in the door, Patty said, what do I have to do to be saved? And I said, what? You don't even want me to talk to you about Jesus, and now you're asking what do you have to do to be saved? And she said, yeah. She said, if I'd done that at home, my mom would have been so mad at me and she said, if God can make you forgive me for that, I want him. He must be pretty great. So she did. So, I started learning things about God and learning that I can trust him to do his work when and how he wants. And if it involves inconvenience for me, that doesn't matter, because in the end, I loved having her. She was so different. Everything was different. And it was a real good relationship with her and her sister. So anyway, that was in my first 5 years. But after 5 years, I went home, got married, came back, and we moved when I was pregnant with our first baby, we moved into a Chinese village. And again, I was the only foreigner in Xinhuan after Vera went home for over a year. But when she came back, she was still in Xinhuan, but we had moved out and moved to a different place. And we moved into this village, and we were the only foreign family in the whole area, and Vera was probably gone by then too. And so the people in the village were overjoyed, and they loved showing us off. When their friends came into the village, we could hear them because the village was tiered. It was kind of like an amphitheater. And we could hear people down there talking, and they'd say, we've got some foreign devils here, a whole family of them. And you know what? The little girl's got gold hair, mind you. And they got the smartest doll. She can understand English. And the missus, she can cook American food. It was funny hearing him talking like that. Other things I heard weren't so funny, because this village, it was 2-story houses with tiled roofs. And the downstairs, all of them were factories. And the upstairs was where people lived. Below us, we rented 2 because they were small. They were 600 feet. And we were trying to start a church in our home. So we rented 2 of them. And so on the one side, it was a tin can factory. And day and night, he had that heavy machine, thunk, thunk. And I mean, the stuff on the walls, shake, and the tea kettle on the stove, the lid would rattle. And the other side was a carpenter shop. So there was constant, saws going and sawdust like you never saw. And so that's where our home was. And the workmen that worked downstairs, when my kids would go out, they'd play with village children, but I'd hear the workmen downstairs talking to them sometimes, and I'd hear them teach them some words that they should be learning, and they'd say, they got it so they could say it, and they don't know what they're saying, and then they say, "Now don't say that at home, or your mom will beat you to death." Don't say anything. And it was funny, it was funny, but sad too, because not all those factory workers ever came to know the Lord either. So anyway, we lived in that village, and we wanted to help the people. There was 100 of these homes. The government gave it to them because they confiscated their land for development. So we went one home after the other. I think we visited every single home. We invited them to come to our house to learn about Jesus. Guess how many came? We lived in that village for 20 years. 1 man came. So the people we did reach weren't there. They had to walk into the village because there was no transportation there either. And but a small group did come. But this guy, the reason he came was because his dad was the headman of the village, and of course he wouldn't be apt to come very easily. But one day, his mom was worshiping the gods at the foot of their stairway, and there was an umbrella hanging on the railing, and the umbrella caught fire. And he thought, wow, we're worshiping them, and they burned our umbrella. So then he thought, well, what's the use of that kind? I'm going to go and find Mr. Epp's God. And so he came to know the Lord. And he lived through a lot of difficulties, but he was one of our main standbys in our church. When we finally got a church going and everything, he was one. And there were also 2 little girls that played with our daughter Florence a lot, especially the one did. And we hoped so much, and I taught them piano, and we invited them in for meals, and the parents liked us real well, and the grandparents did too, but nobody was willing to budge. And so the girls went off to Canada to school, still nothing. And finally, when the first one came back, she came to the church. We weren't there anymore. We had a church by then. She came to the church, and I saw her, and I said, "What? How come you're coming to church?" And she said, "Oh, I'm a Christian now." I said, "What?" "Yeah, and my sister is too." They found the Lord in Canada. And so then I said, "Well, how come you came back?" She said, "Because my parents aren't Christians, and my grandparents aren't, and we want to come back and help them find the Lord." But we had to wait, how many years? 15 years for that to happen. So God knows what he's doing, and you have to be willing to go by his clock, because you can't rush and push. And you know what? Later on, quite some year, maybe 10 years ago, our children came back. Maybe it was when they had a farewell for us. Our children came back, and these girls' parents drove a school bus, and they had transportation. They took us all out to a place that we all used to like to go. And here were these 2 girls. They both married Christians. Their children were growing up to love the Lord. And our children had known them since they were babies, especially our daughter. And it was such a wonderful time when we could all share together what God can do. So then our church moved. We got out of the village, and we went, borrowed a few places. And finally we got a place of our own. And now we had some, crowd, maybe 20 people or something like that. And we were trying to figure out how to reach more people. And people gave various advice, go out in tracts, hand out tracts. We'd handed out tracts, held evangelistic services, so we did, but nobody would come. And we even rented a restaurant near our place and held some kind of a festival there. We got one guy that has mental problems, but that's all we got out of that. So what are we supposed to do? And I never did things like teaching English and stuff, because I thought I went there to preach the gospel, and that's what I should be doing. But while I was asking the Lord to show me what I should be doing that's different, a Chinese lady that I had gotten to know real well, but she wasn't a Christian and not interested in being one, but she did come into the church sometimes to meet with me or something, and she said to me one day, you know what? She said, I feel such love in this place. Why aren't you doing something for people on the outside? I said, well, I'd like to. And she said, well, you know what? Here in Xinhuan, the English standard in Xinhuan is very poor, even still now. And she said, there's all these kids that come home from school, and they got masses of homework to do. Their parents are in the factories, and they don't know English, and they don't know much anyway. They're not educated people. And so now there's people taking advantage of them. She said, there's people that will open their home and say, come to our house, we'll tutor your kids. And they don't know anything. And they take money from these poor people, and the kids still don't learn anything. She said, you've got a place here. Why don't you open your place? Well, that's just what I was asking the Lord for. And it turned out we had one girl that was a kindergarten teacher that was willing, and a couple others are willing to help part-time. And so we did. We opened a learning center, and we eventually moved to a better place. And for years, we had that learning center. And the learning center was, we tutored the kids in English during the week and tutored them with their homework. But on Saturday, I started what I called a kids club. And so that was, they had to pay for their tutoring because we had to pay a mortgage and get our place paid off, and we had to pay the teachers. But Saturday was free. And we had 1 hour of English and 1 hour of Bible stuff about the Lord and 1 hour of playing, because the kids in Xinhuan had nowhere to play. They never got to shout or make noise. We got a ping pong table and, other games, and they could play for an hour. And the kids loved it. And so doing that, we started being able to reach the kids and even their parents. And I remember one of the ladies saying to me, Mrs. Epp, I have lots of friends that are Christians. And I said, oh, do you go to church with them? No, she said, they're so hard to sell. They're always wanting me to go to church, But she said, but I'm willing to come and listen to you because you help my kids. And that to me was verification of, what the Lord had given us to do. The church took it as a real mission. And that was really their mission, and others in the church helped. And gradually, we started getting a few people. And among those was one, her English name was Vicky. She was a single mom. And she had a son, and she enrolled him in the courses we had. And he wasn't remotely interested in anything that we were offering about the Lord, but he liked, being in the playing games and stuff. And we always put on a play. In the summer, we'd have a summer thing, and then I'd write plays for the kids, and they could perform, and then the parents would come and watch, and then I had a chance to speak to the parents too. So one day, this boy's mom asked me to come and talk. She wanted to talk with me, and she talked with me a long time and wanted some advice about whether she was sending to the States or not and all this. And so finally she said, well, you've listened to me for a couple hours. I'm willing to listen to you too. And so she started coming to the meeting I had for moms. But she still wasn't. And one time she said, what you said today was really good about God. And I said, oh, are you ready to? No, I'm not, I'm not really interested in that. But a week after that, I had hired a bus to take all our kids out to a place on the coast where they could fly kites. And we bought every kid a kite, and I got some of the men from the church to go along so they could teach them how to fly the kites. And, this was a big deal. And I invited parents to come if they wanted. So I got to church early to get everything ready to go, and there was Vicki at church. And she said, Mrs. Epp, what do I have to do to become a Christian? Do I have to do this? And she made the sign of the cross. I said, Vicki, just last week you told me you're not interested, you're not ready. And she said, well, you know what? She said, on Tuesday this last week, Tuesday evening, my dad had a heart attack, and we took him to the hospital. And the doctor told me to call the whole family because he wasn't going to make it till morning. And she said, I stood by his bed, and I didn't want him to go so quick. And I asked the Lord, that if he just let him live till morning, at least, I believe. And she said, you know what, that was Tuesday. He went home from the hospital today. So now I'm ready. I got to keep my promise. I've got to do it right away. Tell me now. I said, well, would it do to wait till we get in the bus? Okay. So we got in the bus, but I mean, it got 60 kids and their parents, and you can't just sit there. So we finally went out to the place where we were going. And when the kids all had their kites going and now everybody was busy, then Vicki and I sat down. And she didn't know anything. But she's the kind of person that as soon as she asks you one question, you start answering, she's asking you another one. So it wasn't that easy in one little situation or one little setting to explain the whole thing. She said, I know some about it. I mean, I know that Adam was Jesus' father, and I mean, she was telling me these things she doesn't know anything about, So finally, anyway, and she was worried because she has to work to support her son and her mother and her father who are living with her, and she can't go to church on Sunday because she has to work 6 days a week, and then she has to do all the shopping and the laundry and everything. And I said, well, you know what? You could trust God about that. He knows about that. And if you just let him into your life, he'll show you. He'll make some way for you. And so, it took a while. First she came one Sunday a month, and then it got to be a little more, and she's one of the strong ones in our church now. And you will be doubly interested, the ones from this church, because she really wanted her son to know the Lord. And she'd have him come for an appointment with me, and she wanted me to bludgeon him into believing, and I didn't do that when he came. I knew she had sent him, and I knew why, and I knew he didn't want to hear it, so I just talked to him nicely, but not try to push him. And so finally, after that not turning out right, she wanted him to come to the States to study. So she asked me if I could find a Christian home for him, where there was a dad in the house, and that he would have some kind of a man in his life that was Christian and that would welcome him and help him. I tried. We go to Rolling Hills Covenant Church, and I asked around. There was nobody that wanted a teenager, 17 years old, whose English isn't very good, and who isn't a Christian and doesn't want to be one. So I couldn't find anybody. So I had to find somebody that wasn't a Christian, a kind of a weird little old lady and he went there, and it wasn't a real nice situation. But the one thing I did was to go online to find a church where I could take him, and he would be welcome. So I found one little one, and that didn't look very promising. And then I saw Bread of Life Church, so I checked that one out, and there was somebody named Daniel who answered the phone when I called. And Daniel was so friendly and so kind that I brought him. I brought this boy up here. I came with him at first. And I think you know him by the name of Mark. How many of you know Mark? Well, probably you don't, but you don't work with the youth. Yeah, and he came, and he's been coming to this church, and I think he's brought a friend or two here, and he has accepted the Lord. He still hasn't been baptized, but he's walking with the Lord anyway. And so, you never know, and you just have to follow and do what the Lord gives you to do. Finally, after going a long time in Hong Kong, I finally had a chance to do something for China proper. I got to start visiting. In 1979, the last day of the year, we made our first trip to China. We couldn't go before that because we're missionaries and they wouldn't let us in. But we were able to join a tour then because I had this learning center, and I could go as the learning center, leader at the learning center, and so we got in. And that's when I first went into China, and my whole family went that time. And then after that, they didn't keep going, but I did. And I ended up in Foshan. And that's a city west of Guangzhou. I was in Guangzhou a lot too. And having many chances to share the Lord with them, even though it was illegal. And there were so many hurting people in China when I went there. In Foshan, where I was a lot, this one girl said to me, I wish I'd been born a pig or a dog, because then I wouldn't have to know or care that life has no meaning. She eventually came to know the Lord, and her family did, and there were others too. And so, to me, that was just a wonderful thing. I was finally in China. That's where I wanted to go all the time, and Hong Kong was China, but it felt different being in China. And the Lord just gave me many opportunities. One time, and this had to be pretty quiet, but one time I was invited to speak to a group of teachers, university and high school English teachers. And it was at night in a secret place. There were about probably 30 of them there. And I thought I was going to be talking to them something about English. But when I got there, they said, we'll give you an hour, and we want you to tell us what Christianity is all about, because we don't know. And I hadn't prepared anything to do that, but, I did. And when I finished, then they started the questions. How could there be this God you're talking about who loves people? When they had just finished the Cultural Revolution, and they started telling me about the suffering that their families went through. Some of them were crying, telling me how their parents had to kneel on glass, and they had to beat their parents, and the whole crowd the mood there was so depressing. And they said, tell us, how could God exist and let that happen? We didn't turn our back on him. We didn't know anything about him. We never heard of him before. And, what could I say? I said to them, you know what? I can't represent God to you and tell you exactly why he does and what he does and why. But you know what? I've had questions too. And I told them about 2 weeks before that, I had to have a brain scan in Hong Kong. And I wasn't supposed to take the medicine they give that I wouldn't be allergic to it because I have allergies to a lot of medicine. So the hospital didn't want to do it if I wouldn't have that medicine. But my doctor said I couldn't because I already had too much of it in my system. So they made my husband and my daughter come in, and they told them in English and Chinese how I would die if I died, of anaphylactic shock. And they made me sign a paper that the hospital isn't responsible if I die like that. So I went to have it. So they rolled me down in a gurney down to the basement where the place was where you get your pictures taken. And when I got down, I found out that the machine was broken. So there were several lined up ahead of me, so it's going to be a long wait. So I'm laying there, and I'm thinking, and I finally said, Lord, I might be seeing you soon. And if I do, you better be ready, because I'm coming with a lot of questions. So that day with this group of teachers who are crying and, being, how can God exist and everything, I said, I can't pretend even to tell you why God does what he does. I can just tell you what happened to me. So I told him that, and I didn't die. I only had a small reaction to the medicine, and I'm fine now. And when I told him what I had said, you better be ready because I'm coming with all these questions, one guy at the back piped up and he said, well, obviously God wasn't ready to see you. So that changed the whole atmosphere at the time. But later, I was arrested in Fatsan, and it didn't surprise me. I've been going there almost 10 years. And it was illegal to be in people's homes, but I was. And I was other places in China doing some of that too. And so finally one day, I was speaking to a group of probably teachable English people that were in the English club. There was a whole big group of them, maybe 60 of them. And one of them says to me, one asked me some questions, and when I was answering, all of a sudden he stood up and shouted, and he said, hey, anybody want to know about Jesus and about Christianity? Come on over here. So a whole crowd came over, and finally they found a place, and they all sat down, probably as many as that, or maybe that many. And so I just started at the beginning and was just talking. I didn't talk very long. And I noticed this one guy in the middle that had to have it translated all the time. And these are supposedly people that know English. So that, surprised me a bit. Next thing I know, there's a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, and there's two, what do you call them again? Anyway, that's soldiers. And so, you could have heard a pin drop then. Nobody moved, nobody said anything, and they says to me, what are you doing here? You know what? You're breaking the rules. You're doing what you're not supposed to be doing. Come with us. So they turned me around and they walked me out. And boy, everybody was looking at the floor, except when I got to the very back, one guy, one of the ones that I knew better than some of the others, he said to me, are you okay? Well, I wasn't very okay. So they took me out to one of these black cars with curtains on the windows so you can't see where you're going, and nobody can see who's in there either. And we drove for a while, but they ended up taking me to my hotel, which was the main hotel in that town, and that's where I always stayed. So they took me up to my room, had the key, and opened it, and took me in, and I'm scared stiff, but I'm not scared that they're going to torture me or anything like that. I'm scared I'll never get back. And so they ransacked all my belongings to find it. First they told me to give them all the books I brought, and they told the people back, and I guess they had a long session with them telling them how I'd been coming for 10 years and spreading bad stuff and all this, and they were supposed to give I'd only given out one copy of a book that I'd written for China, so they didn't have much to hand them. So anyway, they made me write a confession. They wanted me to write it in Chinese, and I said, I can't write Chinese. They said, oh, yes, you can. Because by then, I had some books published by the Christian Communications that were written, that I wrote for. They had asked me to write for China. So anyway, I wrote it in English, and I said, I realize I've broken the law today by giving one copy of one book to people. And I don't know if they could even read what I wrote. But they recorded everything, so we had a few hours there. And finally they said to me, well, we'll let you come back. You can come back to China. That was my main worry. But they said, you can't talk to anybody about Jesus. And I said, well, what if they ask me? You still can't. Well, I didn't promise. So then it was time for them to leave. And they said, okay, you can come back. I said, how can I come back? You've done that publicly, and here I am in the hotel where I always stay. They've seen you bring me up here. Oh, they said, we can fix that. So they come on. So they walked me out of the room, and we walked to the elevator, and they chatted with me as if they were the best friends I was the best friend they'd ever met. So we had all that, and we'll see you next time, and all this. And they got into the lift and went downstairs, and then people came up around from the floor, and they said, we didn't know you had so many friends here. I said, I didn't either. I didn't tell them that. So anyway, Christian Communications asked me to write some booklets for China, and I did. One was called Yao Yi Dik Yan Sang, Life with Meaning, and I wrote that not assuming that anybody there ever heard of God or knew him, because I knew that the books we usually use in the States for evangelistic work, they assume people know there's a God. They assume people will believe he's there even if they don't want to have anything to do with him. So you can't start there in China. And so it started with just, what do we mean when we're talking about God? And what's he like? And, and then a man who claimed to be God, was he really? And it goes right through to how to be saved. And so that I found out some years later that went all over China, and people told me that they'd write it hand copy because maybe their village only had one, and they said we copied that like we copied the Bible. And I mean, I didn't feel flattered or anything. I just felt so thankful because he had called me to China, and I felt no, I really was a missionary to China. And later I wrote a shorter version of it because I wrote that for intellectual people who can think. And I saw that peasant people couldn't, uneducated people couldn't really get it. So I wrote a shorter version, the same contents, but easier. And I wrote that in an authoritarian manner. Because the other one, it's for them to think. But that one, I just told them. Because I found that country people and people without a lot of education, if they think you are anybody that they can trust, they'll believe anything you say. And so those books they're probably out of print by now, because that was a long time ago. But I still have a few of them, and I still can use them when Chinese people from mainland come here and they don't know the Lord. It's still really useful to have them to give. So anyway, then, John, my husband, went and pastored the Emmanuel English Church, Ling Guangtong, about 15 years before we left. And that was just around the time of 1997, when everybody was leaving Hong Kong. And you know what? Before 1997, Christians were the largest people group that left Hong Kong by quite a bit. I read this in the newspaper. And so the churches were bereft of pastors and deacons and elders and choir members. And finally, he and I had started a church together. And, it grew and grew, and the Lord blessed us. And then the Emmanuel Church asked if he would come and be their pastor, because they were bereft of almost everything that they had. And so he said yes, and he went, and he had a good ministry there and really enjoyed it. And I thought I'd be going after maybe a year. I said I'd stay and look after this church until finally, we got somebody, and I thought we could get a seminary student probably to work. Well, there weren't even enough seminary students to go around. I ended up being a pastor for 15 years. And that wasn't something I'd ever envisioned. We didn't even believe in women pastors. But there again, the Lord gave me so many opportunities to learn and grow. And, be tutored by him. So finally, in 2005, John retired from Emmanuel Church, so we came home. And you can imagine what that was like for me. I just couldn't hardly face it. In fact, the first time I had to come home, 5 years after I went, I found myself a few days before it was time for me to go, crying like I did when I left, and saying, I can't go, Lord. Because those people have become my family. And to this day, they're still like my family there. And of course, now that I've got grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they're still my family, and I'd prefer to be there if I could, actually. But, you know, he's brought us here. And so now what? Every year until 1914, that was the last year I went back and spent some time there. We still had our workshop. And the Lord gave me 2 really dedicated teachers that worked with me for years. And we kept, when one class graduated, we closed down. We didn't, get a new batch in. But there's still 3 little kids that are 5th graders that started when I was still there, when I was still going. And the class has gone down a little bit in size, but there's still those 3. They come from non-Christian families, and one of the teachers is still faithfully teaching them. And I write lessons for them every week, and I correct their stuff, and I write lesson plans for the teachers because they never had a chance to get much of an education either. And so that's one job. And people in Hong Kong call me a lot and come here and visit us. We've had unending visitors this year. Just a week ago or so, a couple came, and he had not found the Lord. I'd known him since he was 12 years old, but when he was here, and he's 48 now, and he finally prayed to the Lord. So there's an ongoing something. It never ends as long as you're walking with the Lord. And the really good thing is that even here, one time when I went back, a lady in the church, we were in St. Louis then, and a lady in the church, a Chinese lady, wanted me to go visit her father in Kowloon. And she said that if I'd go, she'd send a present or something to him, and she'd want me to take it to him. And he was old and getting deaf, and his wife wanted to believe in the Lord, but he wouldn't. So she asked me if I'd visit him, take this parcel, that was an excuse. So I went, and he turned out to be a very famous man in China. His name is Ting Gabing. I don't know if you've ever heard of him or not, but he has actually funded a university in every province of China. Not only funded it, but kept it going and visiting it all the time, visiting them all the time. And he was in his 70s. And I really came to love that man that day sitting there with him. He told me first, he spent an hour or so telling me about all the good deeds he'd done in China and all that. And then he said, but you know what, I really admire you missionaries because I use my money, you use your hands, and you actually get in and help people. And I said, oh, do you believe in our God then? He said, oh no, I could never believe in a God that lets us Chinese here sit for thousands of years, we've never even heard his name, and then he sends us to hell for not believing in him. How could anybody believe in that? I said, well, how are you sure they're all going to hell? Where did you find that out? He said, well, isn't that what the missionaries say? Doesn't the Bible say that? I said, well, I can't talk for God and say what he's going to do. I know that he's fair. And if there's any way that he can keep people who've never heard about him from going to hell, he'll certainly do it. And I asked him if he'd be willing to read my booklet. He said he would. So I left one with him and I went home. Pretty soon I got a handwritten letter from him, a whole page, saying, I read it. I'm thinking. Well, I did write back. I'm not very good at writing Chinese, but I did my best anyway. And I hope to go and see him again. But the next year, his daughter, who had introduced me to him, had said that she was going to be in Taiwan, and she'd go over there when I was in Hong Kong, and she'd go with me because he's getting so deaf, she was afraid he couldn't even hear me. So we arranged that, but somehow there was some problem.